Glag, and I'm a professor of religion at the University of Central Florida.
Hi, my name is Amy Langenberg. I'm a professor of religious studies at Eckerd College.
So Amy and I are the co-organizers of Abuse, Sex and the Sangha, a series of healing conversations. As many of you are aware, North American Buddhist communities have been the site of reoccurring sexual misconduct and abuse cases. This series of conversations brings together practitioners and scholars to examine multiple dimensions of abuse in Buddhist contexts and to articulate best practices for building safe and inclusive sanghas. Today is the third conversation in our series. The topic is Buddhist sexual ethics, and we have one upcoming conversation in October on the topic of sexual misconduct and legal liability issues in Buddhist sanghas. The series is sponsored by the Religion and Sexual Abuse Project and funded in part by the Henry Luce Foundation. And you can find details of both the project and the upcoming talk in the chat box.
We want to acknowledge the reality and pervasiveness of sexual abuse. According to RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest Network, which is the largest anti-sexual violence network in the US, an American is sexually assaulted every 73 seconds. 1 in 6 women have been the victim of rape or attempted rape. 1 in 33 men have been the victim of rape or attempted rape. 1 in 2 transgender individuals have been sexually abused or assaulted. Given these statistics, we recognize the likelihood that our audience today may include survivors of sexual assault. We wanted to signal that some of the material presented today might be distressing. We encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. We include the National Sexual Assault Hotline, online hotline in the chat. We are also available if you want to check in after the talk. Anne and I personally want to thank survivors of sexual violence in Buddhist communities and beyond, whose feedback has been invaluable to us as we continue to work on this research. Finally, Anne is speaking today from the traditional territories of the Seminole and Miccosukee people, and I'm speaking from the unceded territories of the Seminole and Tocobaga peoples. We want to acknowledge that there is an epidemic of sexual violence against Indigenous women. More than 1 in 2 Native women have experienced sexual violence. Native Americans are twice as likely to experience a rape or sexual assault compared to all other groups. The series is free, but if you can, we encourage you to support one of the organizations dedicated to ending sexual violence against Indigenous women from the Tribal Coalition. Before we introduce our speakers, Karen, who is our host at Buddhist Currents, Karen Meyer, will share some housekeeping details.
Hello, everyone. So today for the questions, so there'll be a period at the end where the audience can ask some questions, and we're going to have you do this on this separate app, and I'm sharing the link with you now in the chat. And the chat for the Zoom is disabled, and this link will enable you can enter your name or you can submit a question anonymously. So that's one of the advantages to having this link, the separate app called Slido. And you can also vote. If somebody else, look at the questions, if somebody else has already asked your questions, you can put a thumbs up to that rather than writing it out again. So thank you for joining us, everyone.
So before we introduce our moderator for the panel today is Willa Blyth Baker, and Willa is a teacher, author, translator, and founder of the Natural Dharma Fellowship.
Thank you, Anne. And I'm going to begin today by introducing our panelists in the order that they will be speaking. Kali Nyima Cape is a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, specializing in Great Perfection Dzogchen literature, women, gender, and sexuality. She is currently completing her PhD at University of Virginia as a Ford Foundation Fellow, where her research is focused on consort literature in 14th century Tibet. She is also currently serving as an adjunct professor at Dickinson College. Zhu Liang is a visiting assistant professor of religion at Denison University. She is a scholar of Tibetan Buddhist literature, history, and culture, and writes about the intersection of womanhood, gender, revelation, and narrative in Tibetan and Himalayan Buddhist communities, past and present. Sarah Jacoby is an associate professor of Buddhist studies at Northwestern University, who specializes in Tibetan Buddhist literature, as well as gender and sexuality studies. She is the author of Love and Liberation, autobiographical writings of the Tibetan Buddhist visionary Sarah Khandro. Sharon Su is professor of Buddhism at Seattle University and author of Occupy This Body, a Buddhist memoir, Silver Screen Buddha, Buddhism in Asian and Western Film, and Being Buddhist in a Christian World. She teaches and writes in the areas of Buddhism, gender and race, mindfulness, and trauma-informed mindfulness. James Robson is the James C. Kralik and Yunli Liu Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, and Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard University Asia Center, and he recently was appointed as a Harvard College professor. He is the author of The Power of Place, Religious Landscape of the Southern Sacred Peak in Medieval China. Amy Harris Langenberg is an associate professor of religious studies at Eckerd College. She teaches and writes about gender and sexuality in pre-modern Indian Buddhism, contemporary Buddhist feminisms, and more recently, sexual abuse in American Buddhism, a collaborative project with Anne Glake. Her most recent significant scholarly publication is On Reading Vinaya, Feminist History, Hermeneutics, and Translating the Female Body, published in the Journal of American Academy of Religion in 2020. So I want to welcome all these panelists, all our panelists, and we can get started. So beginning with Kali Nyima.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be a part of this discussion and appreciate that it's happening. So I'm Kali Nyima Cape, and I am a Native American woman. I'm broadcasting now from the territories of the Monacan Indians in Charlottesville, Virginia. And some of you may know me from my role for more than 20 years as a Dharma teacher, as a Lama Tulku, and head of a Dharma organization and centers. But today I will be speaking from my position as a historian of religion. And in particular, I focus on consort literature. I study consort literature from the 14th century. But I want to start by reading an account from a survivor and reflect on what would need to be in place for something like this to never happen again, because it's this kind of question that I bring when I read these historical materials. So here is the account. Quote, when Rinpoche drunkenly grabbed me behind the mandala at Drupchen when I was 20 years old and kissed me, I consulted the American female Lama about the confusing and unsettling event. In response, she told me I was a homewrecker and that I had been flirting with him throughout the retreat. So what did I expect? After this, I didn't know how to act around him. Since he showed particular interest in me, I never knew if at some point he would try to kiss me again or if he would ask me for more. I was always uncomfortable and overcome with self-conscious guilt when he visited the land. And she goes on to say, when another Rinpoche propositioned me for sex at the age of 23, and after I declined, he persistently harassed me in front of our pilgrimage group for the remainder of the retreat. The same Lama, this American female Lama, advised me to keep quiet about the situation so as not to smear his reputation in the region in which he teaches, because so many people and monastics rely upon him. Likewise, her feedback was that I should investigate the cause of his proposition because, she said, you have this come and get me way about you, unquote. So both of these responses are ones that reflect an ignoring of the misuse of power, victim blaming, misogyny. There's so much here in these two accounts. So I share this because as I think through ideas of what would have needed to have been in place for a different thing to have happened, the original encounters, the victim blaming in the end, I think that it's not really just about ethics, and that's my argument here today. Not just ethics, ideas about power, trust, intercultural interactions, ideas about how to respond to survivor disclosures, trauma-informed things. And what really loomed large for me as I do my research is this idea of who is an appropriate sexual partner. So in my research in the consort literature, what I noticed from these texts is that they make an enormous effort to argue for religious sexual practice and to overturn the previous heritage of Buddhist literature that made heterosexual practice seem like an obstacle to liberation. And so this includes cosmological discourses, ontologies, hagiographies, quasi-medical arguments for why sexual practices are good, moral discourses, but not ethical ones. I wouldn't say that these texts have ethical instructions, not in the way that we see so explicitly like in the monastic discipline literature. In this case, it is instructions on ritual practices, yogic sexual practices, and especially how to find an appropriate consort. And I think from there we could glean something that could be potentially very useful, because what I did see is that there is this very richly developed discourse about the problems of taking inappropriate consorts. And I wrote about this in my article, so I'm going to put the link there for you. Oh no, we don't have the chat, but they'll share it with us. What these texts talk about is that if someone chooses the wrong consort, that it has devastating effects. There are social consequences. There are grave soteriological consequences. The person cannot progress in their meditation. They can't become awakened. They will have physical problems with their health. They could get diseases. There's even the idea that it could shorten one's lifespan. And so what I see in the consort literature that I'm studying in particular is that there is this sense that sexual relationships can be dangerous and that a great deal of harm can happen. And it's not just to the male adept for whom these texts are written, but it's harm to the entire community. And so, for example, they say that the merit of the whole community will be lost if the wrong consort is chosen, and that all the wealth will vanish. So there's this keen awareness that there's consequences to sexual activity. But I think this is a really interesting type of discourse that's taking place because it's not in ethical literature, but it's actually in taxonomic literature that's seated within ritual practice. And in that case, I think that what we're seeing is that ethics is part of the story, moral literature, ethical literature, but there's also a lot of other literature around which the grounds for sexual ethics are really being constructed and legitimized. So when I think back to this testimony that I shared with you today, and think about the huge range of ideas and interpersonal customs and knowledge would have to be there, I really want to assert and say, even as a kind of wish for what I would hope to be produced in the future, that we need every type of counter argument in order to reverse the culture of abuse that we see happening, from the stories to Buddhist philosophy to ethical discourses and moral arguments as well. So that concludes my short answer to the prompt, and now I'll hand us back to our moderator.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kali Nyima. And next we have Professor Liang is up next.
Thank you, Willa, for the introduction. And thank you, Amy and Karen, for the invitation and for the organizational work you are doing. For my part, I would like to speak today mostly to the first question you guys proposed about the usefulness of Buddhist ethics in responding to sexual abuse in the contemporary Buddhist communities. But first, I'd like to say something about where I'm coming from. I come from the perspective of a scholar of Tibetan Buddhist literature and culture, and especially Tantric literature and culture. At the same time, I am speaking as someone who regularly teaches courses on Buddhism, gender, and sexuality at a liberal arts college. I would like to propose the recognition of the difference in the tradition itself between secular sexuality and Tantric sexuality, or to speak more generally, to separate secular ethics to Buddhist sexual ethics, and to further consider how this recognition of the difference impact our thinking on sexual abuse in Buddhist communities. To help demonstrate this distinction, I'd like to spend just a couple minutes on an episode from the life story of Yeshe Tsogyal. For those of you who are less familiar with who Yeshe Tsogyal is, she is a disciple of and consort to the Indian master Padmasambhava, who is said to have converted the people of Tibet to Buddhism. She's a teacher and a lineage holder in her own right for the Nyima tradition, and is considered a foremost Buddhist woman of Tibet. In one of her life stories, she is described as having an intimate male companion before she became a renunciant. Unwilling to part with her, this male companion praised Yeshe Tsogyal's physical beauty and unsurpassed virtues, disclosed his affection for her, and begged her to low prison. After a lengthy back and forth conversation between the two former lovers in verse, somewhat reminiscent of the sensual poetry you'll find in South Asian erotic literature, the princess, Yeshe Tsogyal, finally convinced him that it is best that she go forth into homelessness, and gave him a ring made of fine jewels along with other precious items. The jewel ring serves as an important symbolic detail in the text. Yeshe Tsogyal gave the ring to her former companion as a memento, marking their previous affection to each other and her leaving this relationship behind. Later in the story, she was given another ring during her first encounter with her Lama Padmasambhava, at an equally emotionally charged moment. After leaving home, Yeshe Tsogyal was hunted by her suitors and was finally captured. At night, the prince who captured Yeshe Tsogyal was inebriated and overjoyed, so he went into the princess's tent and slept with her without her consent. The next morning, feeling desperate and utterly helpless, Yeshe Tsogyal made a supplication to the Buddha, and it is then Padmasambhava, her teacher-to-be, appeared in the sky in the very disembodied and desexualized form of a young boy with a white body and a crystal top knot. He introduced himself, instructed her not to be despair, and then gave her another jewel band and told her to slip it onto her finger. This magical band magically released her from the shackles of the prince and allowed her to fly to Samye to begin practice with Padmasambhava. So what is the story trying to tell us? I would like to argue that here the new ring given by Padmasambhava is emblematic of Yeshe Tsogyal's commitment to the Tantric vow or samaya, sublimating the old one, which represents her former secular relationship. And I like to highlight that in both relationships, secular or enlightened, there was no room for abuse or assault. Relationships defined within the Tantric community are considered to be devoid of secular imperfections or attachments, benefiting survivors of abuse, and do not necessarily function in an embodied manner. If we take this to be the case, what does this mean for us who want to make sense of the very troubled and very embodied reality of the Sangha? For one thing, I would like to suggest that we should take the views on gender, sexuality, and sexual ethics in the many, many Buddhist traditions we examine seriously. This means to not simply dismiss our tantric relationships as abuse or assault, to not prematurely impose a secular framework in Buddhist ethics, but to query the liberative logic behind it. At the same time, to take something seriously does not mean to take something literally. We should also realize the extreme granularity and context specificity of these discourses on sexual ethics across different times, places, and traditions, and welcome variations and innovations in our own practice. Historically speaking, Buddhist communities have always been making decisions on their own ethics, not just high lamas, but also disciples and regular practitioners. What is appropriate in one context may not be in another. The tradition itself offers incredible richness and variety in its sexual ethics discourse, and we should take advantage of this richness in our consideration. I don't have a readily available answer at this point, but I would like to call for a deeper understanding of Buddhist ethics in all of its historical and contemporary forms, and a subsequent reflection on this understanding. Questions like, what exactly does it mean to sublimate secular intimacy with enlightened intimacy? How does this intimacy take shape in embodied everyday life? What are some of the guiding principles for enacting this relationship? And what can we teach our students about Buddhist views on sexual ethics? We already have a massive and ever-growing body of scholarship on Buddhist sexual ethics, and I will be remiss if I don't bring up Amy's work, The Buddha Did Not Teach Consent, which was immensely helpful in my own teaching. However, the introduction of this research to a more general or practice-oriented community is still only slowly taking place, which I assume is also the reason why we're here now. And in the end, I just like to say a communal conversation on this topic, like we're having now, would be immensely instructive for us all as educators, as students, as scholars, and as practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Liang. And turning it over now to Professor Jacoby, Sarah, as I know her. And just to repeat the question for those people that have come on just recently, are Buddhist ethics helpful for responding to sexual abuse in contemporary Buddhist communities? If so, how? And if not, why not?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Willa, and thank you, Amy and Anne, for spearheading this series on this very important topic. Today, I'll make a few comments that are centered on sexual ethics in Tibetan Buddhism, where I do most of my research. It's really hard to encapsulate all there is to say about this topic at the same time as it's hard to say anything at all. One challenge is that much is lost in translation between Tibetan and other canonical Buddhist languages and English. Words such as sexuality and sexual abuse are not human universals, but culturally specific ideas with their own histories. To say that sexuality and sex abuse have histories and are not understood the same way everywhere across time is not to say that what these words refer to are purely modern inventions or that cultural differences can explain away or justify harm. The problem of sex abuse in Buddhist contexts is not new, and we can and should scrutinize every instance of it with the goal of reducing harm. If much is lost in translation, even more is simply not translated at all on this topic, leaving many contemporary Buddhist practitioners without access to the many Buddhist sources that can shed light on sexual ethics. So with this in mind, I thought I would share just a few take-home messages that I find motivating and encouraging from the Buddhist texts and communities that I've spent time with. So the first point I'd like to make is that there's a very high bar for what counts as virtuous sexual conduct that comes through in Tibetan Buddhist texts. One way to look at this is through Domsum or three vow literature. And I'm going to hold up a good English translation while I do that. Of an example of such a text. While these texts don't uniformly forbid sex between gurus and disciples, they do include extensive requirements for bringing sexuality into the spiritual path. For instance, one has to be able to transform ordinary desire into the recognition of great bliss, transform both partners into wisdom deities, and transform sexual satisfaction into the experience of primordial wisdom awareness. As Tuku Tundup has put it, maybe you can do this while still maintaining celibacy vows, but, and he says, I quote, such claims of attainment are authentic only if you are also able to bring the dead back to life. That sticks in my mind to just think of the high bar that is being expressed in these texts. My second point is about checks and balances, and this brings us outside of the world of texts into the social domain. There's also a good dose of critique and judgment coming from Vajrayana Buddhist communities about sexual conduct in Tibet. These checks and balances influence Vajrayana gurus' behavior in the form of public opinion, reputation, gossip, and the pressure to uphold the expectations of religious institutions, teachers, and elders. There's a kind of small town feel that can arise where people are watching each other. These types of checks and balances have been largely absent as Tibetan Buddhism has made its way into international contexts. And I think that thinking more about checks and balances as useful safeguards that can prevent further abuse is important. And I think there's cultural precedence for this in Tibetan history. The third point is really important, and that is that disciples, and especially women, can do and have said no to sexual advances from Buddhist lamas. These days, there's an all too familiar sort of spiritual solicitation in Dharma centers, in which having sex with one's guru is presented as essential for the disciples, who is usually a woman's enlightenment. A crucial insight Tibetan texts and many Tibetan living masters can illustrate is that women sometimes said no to such propositions coming from prominent Tibetan lamas, and they attained spiritual liberation nonetheless. For instance, the eloquent disses that the Tibetan visionary Sarah Kondro Dewi Dorje included in her autobiography are something to behold. And she is not alone. Another woman who had some choice words for her male solicitors is Jetsun Mingyur Paldron, the 18th century Minderling lineage holder. There's plenty more where these stories came from, and making sure that contemporary disciples know that there's ample Vajrayana precedent for refusing sex and still advancing spiritually is essential. In conclusion, my main point is that careful attention to Vajrayana Buddhist oral and written sources can serve as a resource for building a sexual ethics in which women and girls are not collateral damage in men's pursuit of enlightenment. However, Vajrayana texts and ideas can also be easily misused to justify abuse, a type of spiritual bypassing in which the means justify the ends often creeps in. Also, some Vajrayana Buddhist practitioners tend to emphasize the absolute truth of pure perception over the relative truth of ethical norms, but both of these are truths. Pretending our perception courses in the absolute view while denying the pain caused by sexual and racial violence is not Dharma. I keep thinking about a comment I heard Venerable Karma Lekshe Tsomo make earlier this summer, and I'd like to quote her. Pure perception is saying things as they are, end quote. So if the Dharma really is the diamond-like path to liberation it is purported to be, it will withstand our endeavor to name sex abuse and other forms of harm when we see them, and to work towards creating the conditions for a more robust sexual ethics for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that. And our next panelist is Professor Sue. And she, I introduced her already. So please. Come on.
It looks like I'm muted. Okay. Thank you so much to all of you for organizing this panel and for inviting me. And I'm actually going to be speaking from the perspective of somebody who teaches mindfulness and trauma-informed yoga for survivors and of various forms of trauma. And so I wanted to respond to the second question prompt that was given to us, which reads, what forms of emergent embodied ethical practices might be helpful for responding to sexual abuse in Buddhist communities? And I read this question and I decided that I was going to respond to it from a survivor-centered, body-centered approach. And this is one that's very important in relationship to the textual approaches that have been taken thus far. So thanks for this incredibly important opportunity. And I really appreciate also the emphasis on emergent practices, which align so clearly with the skillful means, right, advocated within Buddhist traditions. And so my approach to the question of embodied ethical practices stems from my own research, training, teaching, and practice of trauma-informed yoga, trauma-informed mindfulness, and also mindful eating to help support trauma survivors to get back into their bodies and to learn to experience safety in the body after traumatic events, whose aftershocks continue to live in the body, sometimes years, decades later. And many of us know, as the trauma specialist and neuroscientist Bessel van der Kolk famously noted, the issues are in the tissues, meaning that the trauma of abuse leaves its imprint in the body, which can no longer or may no longer feel like a safe place to be and to occupy. And so survivors are often dissociated from their bodies and suffer the effects of trauma in their mental, physical, and emotional lives, sometimes for a lifetime. And trauma as we know it is an event that happens to us for which we have no control. It is the foreclosure of choice, and it can be a sudden event like a natural disaster, a major life event like a divorce or a death, as well as chronic abuse, sexual violence, etc. So it is any experience that is going to overwhelm our ability to cope. And within this context of this conference and discussing sexual abuse in Buddhist communities, we need to be able to talk about what survivors can do and what is accessible for them. And so practices that facilitate and support choice making and embodiment to downregulate the nervous system and increase our window of tolerance are essential for healing trauma. And so in order for trauma survivors to heal, the body, as van der Kolk noted, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. And so practices like mindfulness and yoga from a specifically trauma-informed perspective can prove valuable for helping survivors realize that, number one, our present moment experience differs greatly from what our amygdala may perceive as a real danger. So sometimes the brain will respond to a perceived threat and think it's actually real. Secondly, grounding in the body can help survivors increase the experience of interoception, or the felt sensation of the body in the present moment. And these practices are crucial for the body to understand that it is safe and to be able to downregulate the nervous system. So a trauma-informed approach is one that highlights and foregrounds safety and agency for the practitioner through invitational language, through cueing that invites practitioners to determine how one is going to practice. Does one practice with one's eyes open or closed? One can opt into a practice based on one's current emotional state. And I would encourage those of you who do teach mindfulness not to allow folks not to always focus on the breath, because the breath can become dysregulated during a meditation practice and can trigger anxiety. And maybe offer something else, offer grounding through the senses, even through the practice of touch. So when I work with my students, I often will invite them to draw their awareness to their breath. But if that does not feel comfortable or safe, find something else to focus on. It might be something that you smell, something that you hear, even a taste in the mouth, or you can place your hand upon the body, and that in and of itself will help downregulate the nervous system. So tending and befriending the body is incredibly important, and it's the kind of language that we really need to be talking about when we're talking about sexual abuse in Buddhist communities, because mindfulness and meditation is often taught as a kind of disciplinary practice, and often has a very rigid set of codes and practices that we're supposed to follow. But for somebody who has experienced trauma and sexual abuse, these are things that have happened to the person for which they had no choice. So any kind of choice making that a person gets to make, from where they sit, how they sit, eyes closed, eyes open, whether they even sit at all, these are all the kinds of things that are going to help that survivor make choices for themselves, which then will increase the ability to be with difficult and uncomfortable experiences. So the last thing I want to do is acknowledge that there are some things that I teach for my students, one of which is called linking emotions to physical sensations in the body. And this is a practice that helps people learn to notice when they begin to feel the rise of an emotional or physical trigger in the body, so that they can then learn to create a kind of pause of awareness between a trigger and a reaction. And it's not to say one shouldn't react when one is triggered, but to learn how to tend to the body and take better care of oneself, because most of the time we tend to think, especially academics tend to think that we can think our way out of difficult emotions. But as we know, in the world of trauma, that is not the case. And so learning how to address and recognize when triggers are arising in the body will allow survivors to begin to make more choices about how they're going to respond. So obviously there are many more things that we can talk about and do in order to create safe enough spaces in our meditation halls, but these are some choices that are some things that we can start with. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sue. Are Buddhist ethics, I'm going to read the question one more time, helpful for responding to sexual abuse in contemporary Buddhist communities? If so, how? If not, why not? And also the question about embodiment as well that Professor Sue shared. So the next up on our panel is Professor Robson.
Great, thank you very much. First, quick thank you to Amy and Anne and to all the fellow panelists for their presentations thus far. It's raised a number of important questions. I'd like to begin by first pointing out that that these issues are present and real for everyone here today, and the importance of listening to survivors to understand these issues is key and as part of all of our discussions. I'd also like to point out that there's a long history of such abuses throughout the Buddhist tradition throughout Asia. We find the abuse of power, misogyny, and racism throughout the tradition. We find sexual misconduct throughout that same tradition, despite the precepts against sexual misconduct, most notably in the third precept. That precept, as everyone knows, prohibits misconduct in things sexual, but how was that understood? The third precept is almost universally interpreted in Buddhist societies to prohibit first and foremost adultery. There's very little actually said about the types of abuses I think that we're concerned with here. That may be captured in more general ethics, say, for example, in the concern that one should not intentionally harm another person physically or emotionally, and perhaps in the triple teachings combining morality, meditation, and wisdom, or Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. The history of sexual misconduct, indeed rape, was common in monastic history, at least in East Asia, the tradition I'm most familiar with. In a large collection of Ming Dynasty court cases, for example, a full 1/3 of all tales concerning rape are about monks. Now, the issue that I would like to raise in the time that I have today is the use of rhetoric and stories to depict certain Buddhist philosophical teachings, which can then lead to some morally troubling issues. The deployment of teachings of non-duality and expedient devices or skillful means is usually at the forefront of these. The deployment of these philosophies have become very common in Buddhist popular Dharma literature, and those in the West primarily who are aware of those philosophical teachings have often used these stories and doctrines as justification for their behavior. That is to say, to act beyond the rules or to act in antinomian ways. Defeating the passions through the passions. We've all heard that refrain. Those who try to be more non-dual than thou, to show that they're the real understanders of the Buddhist teachings. So for instance, we have tales like Li Yu's famous carnal prayer mat. We have the general knowledge about the Japanese Zen monk Ikkyu, who hopped out of over the monastic walls and practiced in brothels. And the tales of the mad monk, or the Buddhist mop, Zhang Kuang, who glorified his behaviors and transgressions. I'll just read one passage from his account of how he described his behavior. He says, "When I was first in the monastery, I was known as one of the best meditators. I meditated so much I developed calluses from having my feet in lotus posture so long. Once I went for 2 years without changing my clothes. I walked outside in the same way, whether it was raining or snowing or clear sunny day. During those years, the rain washed me. Finally came the day when the difference between meditating and not meditating disappeared. Every act, every word was meditation. From that time on, I have practiced what he calls unlimited action. Sometimes I sleep, sometimes not. When I'm hungry, I eat. Sometimes for days, I eat nothing. I sometimes drink only water and other times bottles of wine or whiskey. I've slept with 1,000 women. And he says, and I gave them love and they became happier people. I never hurt anyone by my actions," he says. "I'm a Buddhist mop. A mop is something that gets dirty itself, but makes everything it touches clean. I have to act in this way. I have to live the Buddhist doctrine, and that there are no distinctions, that right and wrong are projections of our mind." This kind of rhetoric becomes very familiar in certain types of stories we find in contemporary practice. And then the general kind of misapplications and misunderstandings of many of the things that we've already heard thus far concerning tantric practices or heretical groups in Japan, like the Tachikawa sect. I think even the historical situation presents problems for us and misunderstandings among Western practitioners. The situation in Japan, for example, of having a non-celibate married priest that constitute about 90% of the Sangha depicted in Richard Jaffe's work, Neither Monk Nor Layman. And so this role of antinomianism has infiltrated, I think, Western practice and Sanghas and created some of the situations that we're witnessing. Indeed, much of that is also attributed to the issue of submission to hierarchy and the role of those masters. But I would point out this is not just a Western thing, but we find similar claims by masters of issues like this of masters in East Asia, including the Venerable Master Xuecheng of the Longchuan Temple, and the former president of the Chinese Buddhist Association, who had been accused in a 95-page document of seducing multiple female nuns by convincing them of purification through physical contact. And then how that story was squashed by powerful officials and the difficulty of the news getting out about these. So I'll just end by saying, I think one of the things, whether we look to ethical resources that are in the tradition itself, may not necessarily be the best place for us to go, but perhaps it's time to look to the Vinaya instead, which is actually a set of law codes for building and sustaining communities. The laws are clear and precise, and it's necessary for protecting diverse and safe communities. So I'm very happy that the next event is going to also focus on this issue of legal liabilities, which I think is a really important part of this discussion that we haven't heard enough about. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Robson. And our next panelist is Amy Langenberg, Professor Amy Langenberg, and I'll turn it right over to you.
Thank you, Willa, and thanks. I'm so excited to be having this conversation with all the panelists, and I hope that we can continue to be in conversation about there's a lot to learn from each other. And I'm sorry, James, I think I might disillusion you about the Vinaya coming up. Okay, so I am going to answer this question about Buddhist ethics. Are they helpful or not in responding to sexual abuse? Mainly drawing on the Vinaya and a bit on sort of generally the classical tradition, the sutta or sutra texts and commentarial sources. So as we've seen from the presentation so far, this doesn't mean that Buddhist communities today or even in the past have always articulated their ethics based exclusively or even primarily on these exact ancient authoritative sources. However, the Vinaya and the canon in general does constitute a kind of touchstone or an emblem of ethical authority for many contemporary Buddhist communities. And those communities that include monastics, monks and nuns, vow holders, may structure themselves fairly closely based on the Vinaya, although there's lots of diversity there as well. Even those that are not monastic may occasionally look to the Vinaya for guidance. So one example would be the Spirit Rock Meditation Center's Ethics and Reconciliation Council, when it issued a statement regarding Noah Levine, who was an American insight teacher quite well known, against whom multiple allegations of sexual misconduct were brought. They called upon the Vinaya idea of Sangha, which is a category of Vinaya offense that requires a period of separation from the community and penance. So they kind of called on that as a model for what Levine could do. He could undergo a period of separation from the community, some various kind of forms of penitential, practice, and then maybe kind of come back to the community. There are many stories of, as James just noted, there are many stories of sexual violence in the Vinaya. Both monks and nuns are considered rape prone, and both men and women commit rape in the Vinaya. And the Vinaya also includes many cases of what we would term in contemporary parlance sexual abuse. And by that I mean cases where those in a position of religious authority violate the sexual boundaries of those with a lower religious status. The primary aim of Vinaya text is to articulate what constitutes a breach of celibacy. I mean, there are other things the Vinaya does, obviously, but that's a really important thing that happens in the Vinaya. And in particular, breaches that are serious enough to result in permanent expulsion or temporary separation from the community. In other words, sexual ethics in monastic context is focused on purity and celibacy of the monastic and of the monastic community as a whole, so of the individual and also of the community, not on harm done to individuals through sexuality. Similarly, in early articulations of lay sexual ethics, the third lay precept, which, as we just heard, advises against improper behavior in matters of desire or kama. there is a focus on protecting the sexual rights of fathers and husbands, and even those that patronize sex workers, but not really on committing harm through sex per se. In later Indian and Tibetan articulations of lay sexual ethics in Buddhism, and Jose Cabezon has done amazing research on this, there is an increased emphasis on whether the sex act itself is ethically improper in terms of timing, location, orifice, and partner. Hurting the vulnerable through sex is, again, not the main focus of those discussions. So in other words, these sources are not survivor sensitive, they are not survivor centered. Of course, it is possible to interpolate the basic ethical concept of non-harm into Buddhist ethical discussions about sexuality. And Thich Nhat Hanh has done this in his interpretation of the Buddhist precepts, which he calls the mindfulness trainings. But again, I want to just emphasize that the classical tradition itself does not do that. Monastic procedural law, which is very detailed and elaborate and at least partially consensus-based, may provide food for thought for Buddhist communities trying to navigate between the goals of accountability and transparency on the one hand, and community preservation and harmony on the other. And those two goals are sometimes quite very much in tension. So for instance, Jack Kornfield drew on monastic procedural traditions of adjudicating harm and conflict when he established the Ear Council at Spirit Rock, the Ethical and Reconciliation Council. And when he made reference to the Sangha tradition as a possible model for Levine's penance and eventual return to the fold. When push comes to shove, however, monastic law tends to prioritize community harmony and the public reputation of the monastic community over addressing sexual harm, addressing harm. So again, I have many concerns about the potential of monastic procedural laws being all that helpful. And I'll be writing, I have a lot more to say about that. I can't say right now for time reasons, but stay tuned. So are classical Buddhist ethics helpful for communities responding to sexual violation and abuse? In the main, I'm very sorry to say, not very helpful. I do strongly believe, however, that the overriding concern for sexual purity within classical Buddhism means, ironically, that the tradition contains a wealth of practical wisdom regarding a large variety of sexual scenarios and behaviors. Classical South Asian Buddhism covets sexual purity as a high ethical value and a prerequisite for the path to awakening. But it is not prudish or naive about human sexuality. This is clear when one takes a closer look at classical Buddhist accounts of the phenomenology of sexual encounters, namely their almost infinite variety and the complex nature of intention and consent in sexuality. As I argued in an article that I wrote for Tricycle, and I think it's been in the chat already, but I think Anne or Karen will put it in the chat now, these resources may be valuable for developing a psychologically richer language around consent that goes beyond consent as a transactional sort of verbal contract and actually kind of gets into the body more, as Sharon was describing. Early Buddhist sources also frankly acknowledge and enumerate the many ways in which those of higher religious status may use their positions of power to exploit or abuse those less powerful or of lower status. This act of naming is in and of itself very powerful as it pushes against the narrative that somehow sexual abuse is a modern phenomenon or something external to Buddhism. And that's it from me. So thank you very much. And I look forward to discussion and audience questions.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists. And just wanted to ask you a couple of follow-up questions. Some of you mentioned forms of guidance coming from places other than ethical texts, social norming, taxonomies, narratives, etc. What sorts of checks and balances could be put in place in an international Vajrayana context or a Buddhist context to protect students from abuse? Professor Kate Kali Nyima.
Okay, great. Yeah, good. I got the professor in there.
I forgot it.
It's okay. Yeah, well, when I teach Buddhism and gender, one of the things we do is we read research about what is a rape culture versus not rape culture. And I present this piece, even though it's difficult to read because it's very triggering material, but it looks at 156 different tribal societies to talk about what are the ingredients of cultures where they're really rape-free or not rape-prone. And a few of the interesting things about these societies are things that we might logically think of as related, but not necessarily so important, but actually are really important. Like, for example, one of the things they find is that rape-free societies venerate women. Women are framed in terms of whatever sacred ideology that they have. And, you know, for us as scholars, it's easy to critique the kind of feminist appropriation of these images of dakinis and goddesses, but we can see that's actually part of this huge process of changing a culture. And, you know, they talk about rape-prone societies as ones where violence against women is tolerated, no one speaks up. And so we can see that there's so many things that are needing to happen at once. It's back to my argument about having multiple discourses, people speaking up, telling stories, us having the sense of texts and practices that venerate things associated with the female. And of course, this research is really heteronormative, unfortunately, the rape culture research. But you know, it points out something that's really missing in the transmission of Tibetan Buddhism to North America, at least, where we really don't have a lot of these ingredients that would make it a rape-free society.
If I can, I'd like to just build on what Nyima was just saying and add on to kind of really echoing what Amy and Sarah have been calling for is a recentering of the discourse, of the literature, of the focus of our research and translation activity is to find more of the survivors' voices and more of women's voices that is previously either under-translated, under-interpreted, or undermined in many cases. And I think this is to also resist, as Nyima mentioned, the heterosexuality or the heterocentric tradition we have been facing with. So I think that is, as at least the way I see it, one step moving forward is to do more translations that involve women, involve survivors coming from maybe sources that's other than Vinaya for the international community.
Can I jump in and just second what Jue just said? Because I don't know if you can think of translation as a check and balance exactly, but that's what keeps going through my head, that there's a sort of artificial lack of information that comes from not having enough material available in English. And by artificial, I mean that in Tibet, people talk, through generations, people talk. We have an idea that all of this is secret. Some of it is, but a lot of it isn't. It's just not available in English yet. So that's something that I think is really important, especially women's voices as they appear in Tibetan literature.
Just a quick comment on that too, just in addition to the translation, but just conversations like this actually among practitioners, of scholars, of everyone actually participating in it, I think is really important, because those stories and the accounts tend to often, well, they either hit headlines of newspapers with kind of prurient details and things like that, but the actual substantive discussions tend to get not often make it out. I would just say one thing really briefly, just so there's no misunderstanding. this issue about the Vinaya is a really important one. What I meant by my comment there was not to turn back to the Vinaya as a resource for ethical direction and things like that, but rather to actually looking at the law. And what I mean by that is, so it's not about monastic procedural law, but actually the simple law, sexual abuse and the law, and secular law. I think, Anne has written about this, I believe, in the case of Grace Shearson, who pointed out, I think something like 13 states note that relationships between the clergy and congregants or therapists and clients are illegal. So that was more what I was getting at. In fact, I think there might be some analogies that could be drawn here to environmental ethics and nature as well, not to stretch the analogy too far, but even though there was in East Asia, at least, this kind of concern for the environment, even what you might call an environmental ethic, it never led to the lack of destruction of nature. And so this issue of being able to draw resources from the past is a really tricky one and a cautionary tale, I think, for all of us. Primarily in the case under discussion today is that we're dealing with a totally different situation now, where we're, at least in Western Sangha, the mixing of males and females practicing together, and the mixing of monastics and laity. And this requires different rules, in my opinion. That's very different than even the Vinaya context. We're talking about a totally different type of community that needs to have rules and regulations for it, I think, in order to avoid the types of problems that we see. So, thanks.
Yeah, and just kind of lifting up what James just said about the law. And our next panel actually in the series is with Carol Murchison, who is a lawyer and who's done amazing work advocating for survivors. And one of the things that Anne and I have learned from Carol is how important it is to have processes in place. And also we've seen through kind of our research and the case studies we've looked at is how incredibly important it is to have processes in place when something like this happens, that something that is probably not going to come from within Buddhist ethical traditions, textual traditions, or even kind of institutional, traditions. So things like, and actually what Carol has said to us, which is fascinating, is the Buddhist communities could learn a lot from kind of corporate HR departments, right? About how to respond to cases of abuse when they come up. So for instance, it's really key to have an investigation, right? Not to have things be confession-based, right? Not to have the understanding of the situation be confession-based. So someone comes, even if sort of someone who's done something bad comes forward, there still needs to be an investigation. And also all of the kind of procedures in place that protect the survivor, protect their feeling of safety, don't, again, kind of drawing on some of the things that Sharon was talking about, right? Not putting them in the room with the person that they feel violated by or they were violated by. So there's a lot of kind of procedural things that are out there that people in other contexts are doing that Buddhist communities are not necessarily doing, even though the information actually is really available. So yeah, so.
So another follow-up question. How do we manage the reality of a spiritual hierarchy in which the guru has such powerful social capital in order to even out? So even if these stories of survivors are heard, how are they taken seriously in a social structure in which the guru is so central? Or is, I can put this another way, does the centrality of the teacher contribute to sexual abuse in Buddhist communities? And if so, how does one control for that? Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think it's a difficult question, but one of the things that is observed in rape-free societies is that they have women serving at all levels of decision making. And so even though we do have these communities that are really centered on powerful, charismatic figures. There is the reality of having nonprofits, board of directors. There are places where there can be other voices at the table, and that's not always protective. It's why I chose the testimony that I read, because that was a female teacher. So there, having a woman in power didn't help. But, you know, it is something that we see from the research on these rape-free cultures. Like, how do we make it so that there are other voices being heard? And one is at the nonprofit level, at these legal levels, where there's a tremendous amount of power over what's happening in communities that can be leveraged. And I just want to add one more thing about this, reading the textual traditions, because, you know, as I read the consort literature, I think it will change as these things are translated. It has to change how we receive Buddhism so that we're less colonialist in our approach and not so much fantasizing about this like perfect Tibet Shangri-La thing, because there's so much misogyny and androcentrism that's in these texts, alongside these scriptures that talk about how all the Buddhas came from the woman's body, therefore we should worship women. You know, they're both together. It's totally disgusting. Wow, so beautiful. And so I think the translation of these kinds of tantric materials that talk about non-celibate practices, there's a kind of emotional labor that will have to be done, and a transition from this colonialist fantasy of Tibetan literature and tradition, and really having to mature in how we receive a tradition across cultures.
Yeah, I hear this question, and all I can think about is, number one, dismantling all this secrecy and silence and the desire to protect these charismatic individuals. Charismatic individuals are ones that I have the most suspicion about, because they are shrouded in a kind of secrecy that's a shared, it's a shared desire to protect, right, the perpetrator here. And I mean, the only thing that comes to mind, really, my knee-jerk reaction here is believe survivors, right? Like, when people are speaking, you have to believe them, right? And give them the benefit of the doubt. And I'm thinking about, you know, the case with Noah Levine, and the incredibly disparaging remarks about survivors. And so, number one is really believe survivors, and let's talk about the patriarchy with the case with Levine. It's just unbelievable misogyny, reactive misogyny against survivors here. So there's a way in which we're having this kind of conversation that's running in a multitude of different channels, right? So we're having the textual discussion about, you know, whether Buddhist ethics is valuable and helpful, and looking back in textual sources. And there's a need for that and a value to that. And at the same time, from my perspective, as somebody who works with survivors of assault and trauma, like, what's happening in the Vinaya doesn't really matter, right? What matters is that the person who has been abused has a safe refuge and has a place where people will actually believe what they're saying. And so there's, you know, in many ways, we can have this conversation with more participants, right, from various areas that can, and not just disciplinary, but also, you know, in the realm of social work, and just outside of just the Buddhist scholarly perspective, because we're going to limit how we understand this question, right? We're going to limit how we understand accountability and how to address power. So this is a great start, but again, taking it back to the real simple, believe what survivors are saying and hold these charismatic individuals accountable, not just in secret and in silence, but publicly. You know, hold them accountable publicly.
I think canonical materials do really matter. I like what you say. In the sense it doesn't matter, but it does matter in that these resources are used to legitimize and normalize abuse. And so the more we can counter that with examples that say, no, the 14 Samaya vows, in this text, it also says you should be respectfully towards everyone equally with the Lama. And so the more counters we have, the more chance there is of cultivating this culture that's not abuse prone.
Yeah, and that's a different approach, isn't it? Right. That's a much more, I think, a much more progressive approach. Rather than digging, for that one thing, we can say, no, actually, that's not what the text says, or here's a counter argument, and just be very vocal about that, because that's an entirely different response, right? It's a much more proactive response. And that one, I wholeheartedly agree that, will render the text an effective resource, right?
Yeah, and just sort of following up on that, I think one of the useful things about it, as Sarah was talking about, sort of making more parts of the tradition available. So I mean, there's all of this incredible Vajrayana literature that some of you are working on, right? But even the Vinaya, which everyone seems to kind of think they know, but when you actually look on it, if you sort of make it, I sort of have the ambition of making it more available in the sense that, when you actually look at what's there, it's very hard to have a kind of, as you were saying, Nyima, as you were saying, a kind of, Orientalist, romanticized view of Buddhism. I mean, the text itself actually is not romantic about itself, which is kind of amazing for a religious text, right? That is usually not how it goes in religious texts. Like the text itself is kind of like, here's all the bad stuff that people do and can do, and here's all the messiness. It's really, the Vinaya is really about a lot of messiness in human interactions, in the institutions of monasticism, right? It really kind of gets into the weeds with the messiness. And actually, I find that to be very moving, as kind of androcentric and often misogynist as the Vinaya texts are. There's also a kind of real gritty kind of quality to it. It's not really lying about itself, really, if that makes sense, right? So I think in some ways, like, it's not that translation is the answer or something like that. I don't think anyone's saying that, but I think sort of making more parts of the tradition more available to practice communities, that can sort of help give a more robust view of the tradition. That will mitigate against romanticism and will also, I don't know, allow people to kind of be a bit prepared for some of the things they might encounter in a Buddhist community, right?
Thank you so much, everyone. I think at this point, we will segue to questions from our audience. Just one moment, I'm going to pull them up. So question for Sarah Jacoby. Are there examples of women positions lacking social power, i.e. not jitsunmas and so forth, feeling empowered to say no and doing so?
The textual record skews towards people with power of some kind, because the vast majority of women were not literate, or if they told their story, it didn't end up getting written down. And so if we want to think about women's experiences in Tibetan Buddhism, we want to also include oral traditions and actually go and talk to people and spend time in communities, because there's so much more that hasn't been written. But the example that I was talking about, Sarah Condro, is in some senses a kind of rags to riches narrative, although it's complicated because she did come from a position of authority in her natal family, but she left that. And so she did not have a title or a rank, and wrote very eloquently, but there are only a few accounts like that. It's a tip of the iceberg kind of situation. The little tidbits that we find in the textual record kind of hint to larger discourses that are available, but fading without actually going out and talking to people and listening.
Thank you. Question for Kali Nyima Cape. Do the texts you study show concern for the harm or benefit done to the woman being taken as consort, or only to the male and his community?
Yeah, that's a really important question for these materials. There are a lot of places that there is no concern for the woman's perspective there, but there are a few places that it explicitly is there. In the text that I look at, it's the Khandronintu, which are the Dakini's heart essence, and they're really arguing for religious sexuality. And there's a conversation with Yeshit Sogyal and Padmasambhava where they have this dialogue about can she have any man as her partner or not? And then he's directly addressing the powerlessness of her situation. He says to her, you know, you have terrible karma. You're going to end up with these horrible partners. Here's how you should deal with it, and gives her some advice on how to deal with these sometimes lewd men that she might end up with, and so forth. So, you know, in that sense, it's very sad because it's reflecting her powerlessness in that situation. These women were social subordinates. And yet at the same time, it's also kind of glimmer of the conversations that may have been happening. But I will say one thing about these materials is, unlike the Yogini Tantras in India, these are not outcast women or low caste women. These are women that are daughters of lamas that are in the community, that have good relationships. And it was something actually that Harvey pointed out to me when he looked over my article. It's like, oh, well, look, it's not the low caste, it's not the outcast women. And so they're very socially embedded. These aren't women that can just be discarded without consequences. Instead, they're really framed as being in a network of relationships of care with their family members, with lamas, with the people who will take them for these sexual practices and so forth. So overall, no, it's really more concerned with the men's practice, but not completely. There is evidence there, there's glimmers there of some awareness that there are female subjectivities at play.
Question for Sarah and Kali. I know we just asked you guys some questions, but these are the ones that are getting upvoted here. The model of Naropa and Tilopa are filled with abuse, considered necessary. How does a student decide when they feel close to their teacher?
I guess I didn't totally understand the question. Is the question, how does a student decide what is right in the relationship, even if it's abusive?
I think that's it. With a narrative of the master's word being pure, how does a student resist that narrative, or when do they know when they should resist it and when they should follow along with it?
I'm inclined to think about a subject we haven't talked about directly head on, which is fraught, and that is secrecy. And I think that building cultures of transparency within sanghas is crucial here. because when people feel like they're making decisions completely alone about what qualifies as abuse, and what qualifies as what you're supposed to do to be a good Vajrayana disciple, abuse tends to proliferate when there's no one to check in with. And I realize that certain practices do come with Samaya vows that forbid open communication, but I think that we need to be building relationships within sanghas where there's actual transparency about what's happening in that community.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think transparency is a really big protection. And also, I'd just like to say to that question, you don't have to have that experience of jumping off the cliff and going through the hardships that, you know, are there in these hagiographies. And there are so many wonderful teachers who are kind people who will not ask you to do that. And so I would say if someone asks you to jump off a cliff, then it's a signal that it's time to look for another teacher. And I wanted to, just say that in a kind of blunt way, but of course the texts do give us these models of surrender, of devotion, of being in outrageous situations. But there's a difference between texts and real life, and antinomianism, which it's so great that you brought this up, James, that this is really being picked up as an excuse for abuse. But it didn't necessarily take hold amongst most Tibetan Buddhist teachers in Tibet in history. Like, even though it's there in hagiographies as a kind of shock message and so forth, though we do know certain people did adopt these tropes, that isn't necessarily a representation of mainstream Tibetan Buddhist cultures. And so, I would like to just open up the space to really question whether that's actually necessary when there are other options. And I would say that's the time to just really either invisibly or visibly remove oneself from the situation.
Oh, just a moment. Go. Could someone speak to the limits of ethics in light of the power dynamics and relationships of abuse? How difficult it is to say no, to make public allegations. So I know that we just kind of addressed that, but actually that's a little bit of a twist on the question. Are there limits to these ethical injunctions, or any ethical injunctions, when you have a power dynamic?
I can just say something, one quick word on that. I think when you see, one of the reasons I brought up the sort of legal thing here in regard to this is that it seems to me when you look over these sort of headline grabbing cases that we've seen, over 20 more plus years now, is that rarely does anything happen in these cases. And the case in China that I mentioned was initially looked on as an attempt to try to spread the kind of Me Too movement to China, that the voices might be heard. But the cases that the accounts that were brought by the survivors there were completely ignored. And so the more I think practitioners see those types of cases where the survivors are not heard or listened to, or the case gets completely buried and no action is taken, I think it's much harder to even have anybody to speak out. Obviously, there's other power dynamics involved clearly in this kind of power dynamic internally to the Sangha as well, of trying to, taking down these guru type figures that were part of your first question, and all of the kind of legitimizing fantasies that go in to build those figures up, and the repercussions for those who challenge that. So I think there's two kind of really difficult intersecting dynamics there.
I'd just like to add very briefly that just as there's limitations to textual studies as representative of Buddhist history and culture, and there is also limitations of using Buddhist ethics to address to a community and to society that is actually wider than the Buddhist community that it finds itself in. And I don't think Buddhism ever operated really out of a vacuum, just on its own, and it's a perfect little universe. And there's always other localized considerations that is coexisting or overriding this concern. And kind of speaking back to Sarah's comment on transparency and on the vow of secrecy, I think it is almost always the case that there is a vow of secrecy, but in reality, people talk, and there is a culture of evaluating, doubting, commenting on different gurus or different lamas. And there's always for people to get information to have some form of checks and balance in traditionally transmissive models. So I think that's another thing to take into consideration.
Can I just respond also to that, which is that I think we have to think a bit about what we mean by ethics and sort of whose ethics, what is the ethical rule for, who's it being written for, what's it being written to regulate or structure, right? So, I mean, so for instance, the Vinaya rules about celibacy are for a certain purpose. And so certain other kinds of sexuality, which are not in violation of the kind of main rules about celibacy, are not really, ethically problematic. And I could get into more of that. But so, but more importantly, that I think what we really need it to develop is an ethics which centers the survivor, right? I think that is really the kind of ethical reflection and kind of articulation which isn't really present in a lot of the ethical texts that are on offer in the tradition. So I think that's something which we can do within Buddhist context, outside of Buddhist context. It doesn't, I think we can, just because they're not kind of like overtly articulated in the tradition doesn't mean there aren't things there that can help us articulate that. We can also draw from, feminist ethical writings on survivor-centeredness and other places as well, trauma-aware literature and so forth. So to me, that would be the main kind of ethical intervention.
Just to, I think, do we conclude at 5? Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So just to point out that in the chat, there is an email address that has been put there, because I noticed in some of the questions here, there is like an implicit, how does one come forward? And some of those questions, there is a way to come forward to a very compassionate group of people, very small group, just 2 people who can help if you want to begin to share your story. There's an email address there. And Karen, do I turn it over to you, Amy? Wrap
Thank
up.
you, thank you, panelists. We're really grateful that you joined us today. Thank you, Willa, for moderating. Thank you, Karen, for being awesome in the tech side. And we just want to thank everyone in the audience for coming today and attending and sharing your thoughts and questions. And please keep an eye out for the next panel in this series, which is a panel about the legal issues around sexual misconduct. So keep an eye out for that.
And I just wanted to add, Amy, there were a number of questions we didn't get to, and then some of the hosts and panelists have been sending me some answers to specific ones, so we can include those in a follow-up email, and we'll send that to the panelists. And so don't worry if your question wasn't answered.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day. Take care. Bye.
Thanks to you all.